I don't know. This is the kind of stuff I think about a lot, and like how there is this idea that your life can always be better, and that one day I'll do the things that I want to do. I'll be the person I want to be. And this unwillingness to look at the person you are and look at the days that you have lived as the thing that actually makes up your life. And, the person you are, you can't really escape from, and like, or not escape from, but like, you just are that person. Like, you are the days of your life. That's everything that makes you up.
Yeah. But you can decide to look forward and like say like, I'm not going to be defined by that person that I was, and like, I'm going to be defined by the person that I will be, sort of thing, right?
Yes, I think that's true, but I think Cormac McCarthy is sort of arguing against that here, right? Like, he's saying like, no matter what, you are the sum of all the days you've lived and your life up to that point. And people just dream of this one day, and fail to realize the reality of who they are. And I just, I like stopped and had to mark this page when I read it, because I was like, I want to return to this, Welcome, friends, to episode 182 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Cormac McCarthy's 2005 novel, No Country for Old Men. So, James, welcome to a bright and sunny Monday afternoon. Feeling good and reading depressing shit.
Yeah.
How did you like this book? Did it bum you out, or were you able to enjoy it? I'm really curious to know what your takeaway was from this one.
I mean, I don't think it really bummed me out. I think that it brought up some interesting questions. I think it had me thinking about some philosophical topics in ways that I hadn't before necessarily. And it was also just great revisiting a story that I was familiar with but haven't seen in forever. Like, I can't remember the last time I watched this movie. But getting the source material was, it always has that like extrapolating effect for certain like character moments and some of this like philosophical confrontation that's going on in the book. Like, what is the book trying to say here? I think will be a fascinating thing to explore through the rest of this talk.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a lot to say. It raises a lot of questions. And it, in many ways, I feel like the book explores it more thoroughly than the movie. But there is also a lot that's left kind of nebulous, and I feel like kind of up for the reader to decide where they come down on certain things.
Yeah. I mean, to praise the movie, like, I love the way that the things that I can remember is like how atmospheric and how the Coens did leave you to like stew with these characters, and like it's a very like experiential film. Like, it's not something that's like kind of telling you, it's not beating you over the head with the messaging. You can kind of parse through it yourself as a watcher, and I appreciated it for that reason.
Yeah, so we should probably both say we have seen the movie. Neither of us had read this novel. Have you read any other Cormac McCarthy novels?
No, I don't think so. But
yeah.
I've heard his name a lot, and I know you mentioned The Road a lot whenever he comes up.
That's the only other one from him I've read, was The Road, and I've also seen that movie. That's one that we've definitely could cover. He has several others that have been adapted, which we'll talk about when we get into his bio, that we could cover. So I wouldn't be surprised if, we return to this author. I would love to. For me, I had a really interesting experience with this because the writing itself is being executed on such a high level. I read a quote by Saul Bellow, who praised his, quote, absolutely overpowering use of language, his life-giving and death-dealing sentences. And that sort of dynamic range I definitely thought was present, but I also found just the quality of the prose to be comforting in a weird way, even though everything being described is so dark and sparse. I still found it like a warm bath when I was reading it.
Was it just out of appreciation for the craft? Like, were you just like,
I think so. Like, I think I was just like, I knew I was in the hands of a master who and I don't know if you read a physical copy of this book or listened to the audiobook.
A little of both, honestly.
Okay, so there is like weird stuff going on with his prose too, and he's got a very deliberate style.
The formatting of conversations and stuff, is that what you're gonna say?
Yeah. He doesn't. He has very as little as physically possible as far as dialogue attribution. Like he said, she said, that kind of stuff is almost completely absent. Very little intercuts the dialogue in this book, and he does not use quotation marks at all. He also uses very few commas. He just doesn't like them. He's basically said. So it's like he's just like choosing to do different things with grammar, and in a way that the vast majority of authors cannot get away with. But he's executing it on such a high level. I just found it. It's like when you're in the presence of greatness, right? And you can just kind of sit back and enjoy it. So I had all of that going on. It's beautifully written, but also it's like the barren desert locales along the border he's describing. It was reminding me of like Breaking Bad and like that I don't know, that austerity sort of lines up with the cold and harsh realities being described in the book. And so I was taking in all of that. But the themes of the book seems to propose that the entire world is going to hell. People are getting worse over time.
Well, it's from the point of view of of someone who's an elder statesman looking at the future.
Exactly, and that I think is really important to consider. The point of view of Bell, right, is the sort of the main point of view of the book, and that's the Sheriff Bell. But I don't agree with the take, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I understand it, and like I can see why you would feel that way, and I think there's value in exploring that as a topic. But I also just like don't agree with a lot of what was being said. So it was it was like I was so happy and so comfortable and so in the presence of greatness. I was enjoying that, but then I was also frustrated with how much I was finding myself wanting to argue with the book.
Well, I kept feeling like this book was taking very conservative political views. And so there's the moments where it's like, I think change to a certain demographic of people is bad to them, right? So as the world is changing, they're seeing this as like my old way of life is leaving me behind, and they're feeling their age because of that. They're feeling the mortality. And like that's something that's the perspective of the novel. I didn't necessarily agree with it, but I enjoyed the ride that I was able to go on with it.
Well, and it's not presented as necessarily true. One of the things I did end up coming to appreciate about it was Bell has a lot of doubts about his points of view. Like he says, like, I don't really know what I'm talking about. My wife knows better than me, he says many times. And it's like he has this point of view, but he ends up having to sort of, I don't know if we should get into spoilers or not. I don't know. This is a pretty old project.
Yet, but
yeah. So let's just say that like the things that happen contradict sort of some of his points of view, and he talks to several different interesting people. A lot of them older men too, and he gets sort of like some of his views are thrown into question, and I don't think he comes away thinking he has it figured out, and in fact, he kind of throws his hands in the air about not having it all figured out.
I think that's the point, really, at the end. And
so to me, I look at it and say the framing, maybe your framing's wrong, right? Maybe you're asking the wrong questions, at least personally when I read that.
So I wanted to get your take on Westerns and just like, cause this isn't really like a traditional Western, right? This isn't the hero out in the West in that locale.
This is like a post-Western. It's interesting because to me, this feels like the death of Westerns. It's kind of how I was imagining
it's the modern Western, right? It's like, it's not no longer that idea of a Western, but it's still those settings and those themes.
Yeah. I mean, it's embracing some of the genre, but in so many ways it deconstructs it. Right. Yeah. And to me, it is kind of the death of a genre that we don't see very prevalent anymore.
Yeah.
And part of it is because these old school lawmen of the West who were maybe never even real in the way that America sort of hero worships them anyway.
They were borderline superheroes. Yeah. There was periods of time where these Westerns they looked like our modern day superheroes on screen.
Yeah. And here it's like these people and these archetypes don't have a place anymore, and maybe they shouldn't have a place anymore, or maybe they should, but they're not sufficient, or the reality just doesn't match with the sort of fantasy of what they are intended to be. I don't know. It's again, it's asking lots of questions and not giving lots of answers. But I definitely think that kind of stuff is being weighed, because Bell, in many ways, is that old school lawman from a Western film that you've seen, or a Western novel.
Well, and then this novel deals with like drug cartels, and that's like sort of what's happened to the West is sort of like that's there's something going on. There are drug cartels, there's violence due to that, and this is somebody who's seeing like the old school Western, that hero of the West who's always protecting everyone in his town, being overcome by people who he's seeing as like, you know, dealing in absolute violence and all these other things. So it's like that take on, and this kept you said like post-Western, and it made me think like, I wonder if this story, No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, like the actual novel, is the basis for a lot of these movies we see that are like Sicario. Have you seen Sicario?
I have not, no.
It deals a lot with the same sort of themes, and it's like Denis Villeneuve, and it's incredible. So check that out. But it's so I would like to know, because I don't read enough Western or post-Western. I would love to know like where this is along that path. Like if this started a trend.
Yeah, I don't know about like on the path, but I think you're touching on the right things, and I do think there is a fear that permeates this book. I think it's no accident that this came out in the years following 9/11. To me, this feels like a reaction to 9/11. It talks about America as a country and how the perception of sort of outside influences coming in and making things harder, or being beyond the understanding of like the overwhelmed law enforcement. So through at least that lens, it feels like a reaction to some of the knee-jerk stuff going on after 9/11. And I was reading about how some of the reviews for this book were mixed, unlike some of his other books, which have a lot more glowing praise. And a lot of what people were talking about was like morality in his books seems to be very individual, comes from the person rather than from like a god. And this book kind of plays around with that a little bit, and like kind of asserts maybe there is sort of morality that exists beyond the individual that is degrading and being attacked by like modern society, and it sort of like lionizes the past in a way that I'm not super comfortable with. But again, it's not presented as necessarily the right thing. It's always questioned.
Well, that's the main thing for me, is that like the way that it would set something like that up and then tear it down. And set something like that up and tear it down is just like, it's about asking these questions and like seeing what it's having the conversation with the reader. Yeah.
I do think it's interesting. Like, as far as I could tell, Cormac McCarthy has never publicly said what his political views are. So if people are seeing this as conservative, you know, I think that's trying to appraise the author's political leanings just through the work itself, and not really going off of anything he said publicly. I'm not saying that's wrong. I do think that McCarthy has like a sort of nihilist point of view that permeates at least both of these books, this and The Road, in a way that feels apolitical. It feels like it's saying that nothing matters, although that is sort of a political statement in and of itself. That's why I found it kind of depressing, right? Like it's very much like all of this is meaningless. You know, life is full of despair and regret.
Yeah.
You know, like if you try and live a moral life, you're just going to wind up sad and alone.
Yeah. There's sort of a line walked where it's like, anytime a morality situation, a question arises, I think usually it ends up feeling like the randomness of the world, the randomness of life, you know, there's stuff that goes on with, we'll definitely get into it, but like chance and like the idea of the coin flip and fate and some of those kinds of things. And then the way that like doing good doesn't necessarily mean that good things are going to happen to you. And like, you know, so like ultimately like none of these things really do matter. And like what's socially constructed, and like how do we like grapple with that as like people who will die eventually? Like what, you know, why should we be good? Why should we not be bad? You know, as far as this book is concerned, for me, my interpretation was just like ultimately like the randomness of life is that like nothing is fair.
No, I mean, and I think that's nothing is fair. I think morality is in the eye of the beholder. I don't know. There's just a lot of interesting stuff, and I feel like you could write essays about any one of these like assertions that we're making to try and like back it up and talk about all the ways in which the text itself interrogates that question. There's just so much density of thematic material, and it's kind of incredible, and it's difficult to talk about in a short podcast episode relatively. So yeah, we'll do our best, but there's so much you could get into with this book. And what's funny is I was reading that one of the other criticisms of this book is that it's in many ways more straightforward and less thematically dense than some of his other novels, which are even more just like the kind of literary works that people are debating for decades after they come out.
Yeah.
And this one is considered like, not as deep.
Yeah, this does feel like something that's more like generally accessible. You know what I mean? Like anyone could pick this up and read it and enjoy it on the surface level to the subtextual, like whatever you want to pull out of it is there, I think.
I think it's an easier read than The Road, in my opinion, too. I think it's more straightforward story. The prose itself is more accessible. My memory of The Road is that the syntax and stuff actually gets really difficult sometimes. And then, there's like length of sentences and like other things that make stuff really complex. But we've touched on a lot of this stuff, but I want to talk about Cormac McCarthy, the author, because I think he's fascinating. He is widely considered one of the greatest living authors, still alive. He's in his, I believe he's in his 90s or close to 90s now. He was born in 1933. And let's talk about him a little bit. Real quick, this book, No Country for Old Men, began as a screenplay. And so some people theorize maybe that's why it's not quite as dense and hard to
It does feel really cinematic, too. It does feel like something that would lend itself to that.
Oh, and I got to put that out there, too. This is one of those times where I kept being floored reading this book going, I was giving way too much credit to the movie. Like, the movie's great. Like, and we're going to talk about what makes the movie great. But the things that doesn't make the movie great is what actually happens. Because that's all from the fucking book. Like, so much of these scenes, beat by beat, what makes them great is lifted directly from this book. And so much of what makes the characters amazing, so much of what makes the dialogue memorable, it's not even like it's been changed that much at all. It was like...
I mean, like you said, originally a screenplay, so it's going to lend it... Yeah, I think, like, props to him for basically coming up with the entire movie, but... And we'll get to the...
There are changes. Like, there are some changes.
Credit where credit's due. Like, there's also something to be said for actually seeing a character like Shigur in the movie is just like it's a total. He's like
I'm not trying to downplay the value of the adaptation. I think we're going to talk about it. I think it's great, but I was underestimating how much comes from this book and how much credit really is just like Cormac McCarthy deserves for this story.
Yeah,
not the Coen Brothers. Now we'll talk about what they do deserve credit for, I'm sure, next week. But let's talk about Cormac McCarthy. So Cormac McCarthy was born Charles Joseph McCarthy Jr. In 1933. He is an American novelist, playwright, short story writer, and screenwriter. McCarthy has written 10 novels, 2 plays, 2 screenplays, and 2 short stories, spanning the Western and post-apocalyptic genres. He is well known for his graphic depictions of violence and his unique writing style, recognizable by its lack of punctuation and attribution. He is widely regarded as one of the greatest contemporary writers. So there is a ton of cool stuff about this guy's life. It would take me 20, 30 minutes to get into all of it. So roughly, he was born in Rhode Island, but was raised primarily in Tennessee. He went to the University of Tennessee. He was a volunteer. And then he...
Go Gators.
Then he dropped out to join the U.S. Air Force. While he was stationed in Alaska for a time, became a voracious reader. He lived in like immense poverty throughout the majority of his life. Chasing being a writer, he refused to work like meaningless jobs and instead pursued writing, which he did not make money for a long time. His first book was called The Orchard Keeper, which he published in 1965. It got some critical acclaim, people noting that it sounded like the work of William Faulkner. He lived in the French Quarter in New Orleans for a while. He would go on to write a book called The Outer Dark in 1968. Again, not finding large commercial success. He then moved back to Tennessee, and he wrote a screenplay for an episode of Visions, which was a drama series in the 70s, which he was nominated for 2 Emmys for. Then, in 1979, McCarthy published the semi-autobiographical Suttree, which he had written over 20 years, which was based on his experiences in Knoxville, which a critic likened to a doomed Huckleberry Finn. And then this was sort of the big change in his career. In 1981, he was awarded the MacArthur Fellowship for $236,000. The MacArthur Genius Fellowship.
Yeah.
And he was able to research his next novel in the Southwest of America, and he ended up writing Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, 1985. And that book is well known for its violence, and the New York Times declared it the bloodiest book since the Iliad. Although initially snubbed by many critics, the book has grown appreciably in stature in literary circles. Harold Bloom called Blood Meridian, quote, the greatest single book since Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. In a 2006 poll of authors and publishers conducted by the New York Times Magazine, Blood Meridian placed third in a list of the greatest American novels, behind Toni Morrison's Beloved and Don DeLillo's Underworld. So really it was Blood Meridian that sort of got him the acclaim. And then he would go on to write All the Pretty Horses, which I have heard of. I've never seen that adaptation, but I think it's also a movie, which won the National Book Award, and it became a New York Times bestseller, selling 190,000 hardcover copies within 6 months. He then followed it up with The Crossing and Cities of the Plain, completing the Border trilogy. So yeah, I mean, he's had this career. He goes on to publish No Country for Old Men and The Road much later in his career. He's still writing. He has a book that was announced in 2015, but has not come out yet. Unclear when it'll come out and if it'll come out. But yeah, I mean, this guy is one of those modern authors that seem to cut from the same cloth as a William Faulkner or a Hemingway or somebody like that.
Yeah. Unbelievable. I mean, I honestly thought he was a bit younger. So to learn that he's in his 90s, he and the fact that he, like you said, this idea of the struggling actor is real. I mean, this is one of our greatest living
struggling
author. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just in general, to have to go most of his life living in poverty and then eventually create like the next great American novel in his time.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild to think how arts are viewed in this country. Yeah,
I really want to read Blood Meridian now. That's probably the one that I am most excited about. All the Pretty Horses too. Curious about that one. One story I saw, kind of backing up what you're talking about. It talked about how he once got evicted from a hotel that was a $40 a month hotel room that he was living in. Wow. Because he couldn't afford to make rent. Yeah. So how poor he was for a time. So I do want to talk a little bit about his syntax, just for a moment, get kind of nerdy about it. McCarthy uses punctuation sparsely, even replacing most commas with and to create polysyndentons. It has been called, quote, the most important word in McCarthy's lexicon, the word and.
I will say, just to give my experience on it when I was reading it on the physical copy, it was jarring. It was definitely unfamiliar to me, and I couldn't figure out if he was trying to do it because it was sort of a story being told back to us. And I couldn't tell if he was doing something with that or if it was because he wanted it to match the setting and the sort of grammatical things that people that his characters would be sort of using if they were writing things down and stuff. I couldn't figure it out for a little while, but after a while I got used to it and I actually did enjoy it. For the dialogue is really I mean, it's sharp, right? It's very, you're going like line. It's like he'll have a short line of somebody saying something followed by another line, and another line,
Yeah.
just back and forth. And you're left to like infer who's saying what from context clues. And
Yeah.
I really liked it.
I mean, I think it's all voice, right? It's all like, to me, it harkens to like how people actually speak. And it feels very authentic in that way. Let me read this sentence that it has as an example for this language. And this is from No Country for Old Men. He left the beer on the counter and went out and got the 2 packs of cigarettes and the binoculars and the pistol and slung the 270 over his shoulder and shut the truck door and came back in. Like, there's no commas in that, what I just read.
I mean, it was hard for you to just read that out loud, right?
It
like,
is hard to read,
attempting to do that is tough.
Props to the narrator who was definitely putting in commas like as he was reading. I was noticing because sometimes I like to listen to the audiobook while reading the physical copy, and I would notice he would have these pauses where you would expect a comma to be, yet there was no comma present in the text.
It's just how he wanted to read it. He's taking natural pauses because that's how people read. That's how we've been trained to read for decades.
So Cormac McCarthy did almost no interviews. Yet I was able to find one he did with Oprah Winfrey when she chose The Road as an Oprah book club book. He did some interviews with her, and that was like some of the first he'd done. And in fact, he was married 3 times, and I think one of the reasons I read, I can't remember if it was his second wife or his first wife, ended up divorcing him, was because he kept refusing to take paying speaking gigs to come talk about his books. And he would respond with like letters that said, everything I wanted to say is in the pages of the book. And he didn't want to talk about it. And they were like,
it's hardcore,
incredibly poor. And she was like, "What are you doing? Like, we need the money. Go talk." But like, he didn't want to. Incredibly like sort of reclusive author. But in his interview with Oprah, he said that he prefers simple declarative sentences and that he uses capital letters, periods, an occasional comma, or a colon for setting off a list, but never semicolons. He does not use quotation marks for dialogue and believes there is no reason to, quote, blot the page up with weird little marks.
I dare you to say that to a publisher.
I know, right?
When you submit something.
His attitude to punctuation dates to some editing work he did for a professor of English while enrolled at the University of Tennessee, when he stripped out much of the punctuation in the book being edited, which pleased the professor. So, like, it's such a bizarre...
One professor, like enabled him, and he just rolled with it.
He just rolled with it, and it became it's one of the key things of his prose that people talk about. I don't know. That's fascinating. But one fun detail I wanted to give, and then we can move on, because I know it's like a lot. But he's got this storied life of writing. But McCarthy wrote all of his fiction and correspondence on a single Olivetti Lettera 32 typewriter between the early 1960s and 2009. So all on this one typewriter. That's all he uses.
Wow.
So it's not just like this kind of typewriter. It's one typewriter.
Can you imagine if you got a hold of one of those manuscripts that he like typed up on the actual typewriter? Like what that would be worth? Speaking
of that, how about the typewriter itself? So he bought the portable Olivetti Lettera 32 for $50 at a Knoxville pawn shop and typed about 5 million words over the next 5 decades on it. He maintained it by simply, quote, blowing the dust out of the service station hose. Book dealer Glenn Horowitz said that the modest typewriter acquired sort of a talismanic quality through its connection to McCarthy's monumental fiction, as if Rushmore was carved with a Swiss Army knife. His Olivetti was auctioned in December of 2009, and the auction house estimating that it would fetch between $15,000 and $20,000. It sold for $254,000.
I was going to say, that seemed a little low.
With proceeds donated to the Santa Fe Institute, which he now works with, which is another whole thing. But I love this bit. McCarthy then replaced it with an identical model bought for him by his friend John Miller for $11 plus $19.95 for shipping.
Hey, he's smart, he realized the value of that, and he was like, well, just do it again on the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's cool that it went to charity too. So the proceeds went to this charity, but I don't know. He's just like, yeah, this is my thing, man. So this guy does not write on and all correspondence. So if you wanted to, today, there's some literary agent out there who has to correspond with Cormac McCarthy through the mail, in which he writes up letters on his typewriter.
I hope that they're replying on a typewriter as well.
I don't know. He also has talked he throws all kinds of shade at the idea of hanging out with authors. He's like, I don't want to associate with authors. He prefers to associate with scientists. He said he likes hanging out with scientists. That's at the institute is a scientific institute. He's the only non-scientist who's a member of it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Fascinating guy. Not, that's not for me. I like hanging out with authors. I find authors really interesting, but I also kind of get it in some ways. I don't know.
Well, if you're the type of person who wants variety, you want something different than what you're actively doing. A scientist is pretty far from a writer, right. I would say. So it's very different kind of things to talk about.
Yeah. I don't know. He would not approve of this podcast, I don't think.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but
he probably doesn't like podcasts in general.
I would assume he does not even know what a podcast is. Would be my guess, but maybe he does. I don't know. But okay, I think that's enough talking about him as a person. There's other little stuff that I might pepper in throughout if it comes up, but we have this whole book to talk about, so I'm going to divide it up into 3 chunks of plot, and we can sort of react and discuss what happens within each one.
Let's do it.
Okay, so in 1980, while hunting pronghorns, Llewellyn Moss stumbles across the aftermath of a drug deal gone awry that has left everyone dead, save a badly wounded Mexican who pleads with Moss for water. Moss responds that he does not have any and searches the rest of the vehicles, finding a truck full of heroin. He searches for the last man standing and finds him dead some distance off under a tree with a satchel containing $2.4 million in cash. He takes the money and returns home. Later, however, feeling remorse for leaving the wounded man and simultaneously desiring to know more of the circumstances surrounding the deal gone awry, he returns to the scene with a jug of water, only to find that the wounded man had since been shot and killed. When Moss looks back to his truck parked on the ridge overlooking the valley, another truck is there. After being seen, he tries to run, which sparks a tense chase through the desert valley. After escaping from his pursuers, Moss sends his wife, Carla Jean, to her grandmother's in Odessa, Texas, while he leaves his home with the money. Sheriff Ed Tom Bell investigates the drug crime while trying to protect Moss and his young wife. Bell is haunted by his actions in World War II, leaving his unit to die, for which he received a Bronze Star. Now in his late 50s, Bell has spent most of his life attempting to make up for the incident when he was a 21-year-old soldier. He makes it his quest to resolve the case and save Moss. Complicating things is the arrival of Anton Chigurh, a hitman hired to recover the money. Chigurh is a ruthless, calculating killer whose weapons of choice are a silenced shotgun and a captive bolt pistol. Okay, let's stop there. We got our 3 main players and the setup for the book. What are your thoughts?
So I just got to jump to Chigurh right away, just because I want to say, he's not human.
Yeah.
He's nearly not human. There's vulnerability moments of the things annoying things that humans have to deal with, like broken arms and bullet holes and things like that. But other than that, this person represents just a force of nature, evil incarnate and everything. And that's basically inferred within the pages, I would say.
He is he is the manifestation of everything wrong in society, I think, in some ways. Well, he's a full-on sociopath, psychopath, really.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to see, and it's a compelling character, really interesting scary and interesting to read about.
Yeah.
But this character was also giving me not quite the same, but because we read The Stand earlier this year, The Walking Man or the Man in Black, that character,
Randall Flagg.
Randall Flagg, the incarnation, he sort of represents kind of similar things, and they're Western vibes to both of them.
Yeah,
and I kept thinking about that character as we were getting Chigurh, and then Chigurh took it way further. Chigurh I think is maybe more terrifying than someone like that, because it is so grounded. There's a grounded character that absolutely exists somewhere in the world. Maybe this sort of hitman sociopath.
I mean, there's so much you could talk about with this character. He is completely ruthless. He has no empathy, and he is very caught up in the idea of force of will. He has this code where he doesn't allow anyone to be his enemy, because if they are even remotely his enemy, he will kill them. So he has no enemies because they all are dead.
There's this scene that we get where a character's like just like messing with him at a bar or something,
Yeah.
and he tries to ignore it, and then it's like he can do two things in this situation. He can ignore it, or what ultimately happens is they go outside to fight and he kills them.
Yeah.
And then eventually like goes to prison, I believe, at one point.
I don't know. I thought that might even be setting up the start of the novel where he's in the handcuffs.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I thought that might have been setting that up. I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, when we first meet him, he's in handcuffs in a police department, and yet the cop who has him is so unprepared for who he has, right?
Yeah.
Like he doesn't
It's like
realize
a Hannibal
the danger.
Lecter,
Yeah.
Hannibal Lecter type character where it's like calculating, like he will overpower you just like
Yeah.
in well more mentally, like he'll just like figure out a way to just I don't know, he's just this sheer force of will that you can't contend with. And like these cops are like, oh yeah, I got it handled. No, in no way had they had it handled. He like gets out of the like he like jumps over the handcuffs and like chokes this person out and kills them. And it's a police officer too, so it's like that's a statement, right? If you're willing to kill cops, that's a big. You're a different sort of criminal than breaking into homes or something like that.
And it's not just that. He kills that cop, steals the cop's car, uses the cop's car to pull over somebody to kill that person and steal their car, which he then goes on to like kill another person and swap cars again, like just to create multiple layers of separation so that the stolen cars can't be used to track him. I don't know. It doesn't matter. He doesn't care about just killing random people too. And then I think it's very telling that he has this like cattle killing device, because that is how he treats a lot of these kills. Is that it's just like a slaughterhouse. Like it's something that is meaningless to him. Like he views them as cattle who, he has ultimate power over.
Yeah. Very interesting, because it's like we try to figure out the motivations throughout for Chigurh, because like you're like, okay, so like is like obviously he wants this money that we'll eventually learn about, but we don't know like why. Like cuz we can see that like nothing motivates him except like just like butchering people.
Yeah.
He just seems like he has this code and he kills people. And then like we come to find out more about him later. But
yeah, he's been hired by somebody, which is kind of nebulous.
So somebody knows what he wants, but like what drives him.
But he's a loose cannon. Like we immediately hear later that he basically goes off book and just starts murdering everybody, including people who are on his side, ostensibly. So he's just a force of nature out there who's been unleashed on this. But yeah, let's talk about we have two other characters to talk about.
Before Chigurh was even introduced, I was really invested in Moss's story, right? Like finding this cartel deal that went bad or whatever, and then like the person that he like is eventually feels bad for, but leaves there when they're asking for water. And when he goes back though, that's when it really like was hooking me in. Like he's like trying to sneak over, and then he realizes as he gets close like how dumb this is. And then right when he's like getting ready to turn around, he sees that like the person's been killed, and he like sees somebody up by his truck where he left his truck, and it just like very tense scene. And then he has to like escape. And his obviously like I found it pretty unrealistic that someone like this, but it was set up well enough to where I didn't really bat an eye at it. But this idea of him like going back to bring this person water when clearly that person would probably be dead, but just like the morality within this person, which is sort of the some of the themes of the book there, is within Moss, his morality forces him to go back and try to do the good deed here and give water to this person.
And that's the question, like is that his mistake? Like should he have been more heartless? Maybe he would have been safer if he had been. But I absolutely love the introduction to Llewellyn. He's out on this hunt, and all the descriptions of the process of hunting and the specific details of tracking and of the environment, which is funny because it talks about how there's not a lot of descriptions of environment, but the ones we get are incredible. I felt so immersed and so present in the scene. And then he's so careful and calculating without talking about it, like how he's being careful and calculating. He just is. And we see him like when he first finds these trucks, he just watches them for like a really long time. Mm-hmm. And then he's so careful with the way he approaches. And you can, I think there's like one reference about another, like he hasn't done this since he was like a long time ago in another country. And that's the first like indication we get that he's a veteran. Which I think is very important, that like multiple characters are veterans in this book. And I just thought he's such an interesting protagonist, because he essentially is the protagonist, although you could argue maybe Belle is the real protagonist of the book. But he is going to be put against Chigurh, right, in these battle of wills. And Llewellyn is this, he's again kind of an archetypal character. He's this like frontiersman, this veteran who has, the tracking ability, and he's like this crack shot with a rifle and all this stuff, which I think is, and then you put that up against who Chigurh ends up being, and then you include a bunch of police who are completely overwhelmed and overmatched.
Yep. Yeah, I thought a great character to put against Chigurh. We also get Tom Bell, who's the sheriff, who a lot of the story is like framed around this. And you talked about veterans, like he constantly, I think most chapters start with Bell sort of in the present.
Yeah, like a first person, like almost like a diary or something. Unclear what it is he's written, but it feels like a diary, like a diary entry.
Yeah. And a lot of times it has to do with like older, like his I know like his grandfather or something was a sheriff, and he had come back from war as well, and like he's sort of framing the whole world in this like No Country for Old Men, like the title states, like this, like it's like the world is changing, and that's where those sections really can set up like how the world is changing, and like this story is unfolding before us, kind of showing if it is, or if it's changing for the better, for the worse, like what to believe and what's good and what's evil, that kind of thing.
And I can't help but interpret a lot of this as internalized racism in some ways. I'm not necessarily saying that's true of Cormac McCarthy, but it might be. But definitely this character
for some, like people in the South in this time period, like especially like they talk about like his
well, it's set in the 80s, but it was written in 2000, so I think that's also interesting to note, right?
but like when he talks about like his grandfather or something like that too, there's like talk of like fighting Native Americans, I think, at some points, and like stuff like that.
Well, and it is repeatedly set up with the idea of this us versus them. It talks about these people a lot, and it's always like said as just criminals. But I don't know about you, man. I was always reading into like non-white people.
Anytime they talked about Mexicans, I was like, is this the fact that they're Mexicans, or because they're associated with the cartel? There were some Mexicans that showed up within the story that were also treated like they were, not like as important as the white characters, and like at least from the perspective of the characters within the story. Like when, spoiler, like Moss eventually goes to Mexico, I felt like there was a vibe going on where like Moss didn't necessarily respect Mexican people as much as he might have respected white people in America.
Yeah, that's probably true. It's weird because like he's such a great writer that you could maybe say that this is all done deliberately. He's trying to examine these very real ideas that he sees around him, and but I just don't know if I can quite buy that he's totally impartial, because like the messaging behind the entire book seems to be the idea of like these others are coming into America and making it worse. And like I keep thinking of an author like James Baldwin we covered, and how just fundamentally a book like If Beale Street Could Talk, when viewed against this book, how much this book feels like propaganda, right? Like this feels like the kind of thing that would prop up the idea of militarized police. Like we have to be ready for Chigurh, but like Chigurh is a fictional character, like, and even if he isn't, there's like, it's 1 in a million that you're going to see somebody like this. And instead you're having Humvees and giant machine guns and all kinds of other stuff for minor traffic arrests and shit like that.
Yeah, this is reminding me of one thing I wanted to say, because I actually have been to El Paso within like right before COVID. I went on vacation to visit a friend of mine who was living in El Paso, and I saw the border wall, and I was right there, and it's very different from where I'm from. So like getting to see like the mountains, it's a lot of like desert location, very small shrub bushes and things like that. Number one thing, people who are residents of El Paso were talking to me about how like it's one of the most safe cities in the US if you look like statistically, because I know like some people would probably go and be worried about something happening with Mexico, like the cartel is so nearby and all this other stuff, but it's not like that. So I don't want that to be like a thought that like the border is just like chaos or anything. It's not like that at all. But this book would kind of have you believe that in some ways, like you're saying like, oh, border, it can be so sketchy at the border. There's like, war criminal drug cartel people like right outside your door and stuff. And It was a great environment. I liked being there, and it was just like, and also like I was getting to like visualize like that sort of area that I've been to when I was reading this book, so I enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's cool, man. I do want to talk about Llewellyn and Carla Jean. They have some of the coolest conversations. Like their relationship is so interesting to me. It's one of those things. It's like it's borderline toxic. Like it seems like it's very questionable. Yet it seems to work for them, and it does seem like there's genuine love there underneath it all. And Llewellyn and her like seem like they have a really hard time communicating with each other. But it just feels so true, I guess, is where I ultimately came down on. Like, this feels like real people and a real relationship that, you know, exists outside of the public eye. And we're putting it in a book, so we're bringing it in there, but yeah.
Right, yeah. Behind closed doors, I think people would have you, in public, people have you believe that their relationship is a lot cleaner with less fighting and things like that. But, you know, people fight in relationships and things like that. And it does feel real in that way. Yeah. You know, I think they're a little more antagonistic than they necessarily, maybe they both need to go to see therapy or something and like they could work on some things. But like you said, it felt real, especially for like what was trying to be portrayed as the 80s.
Yeah. Well, it's also hilarious. I don't know, like when Llewellyn shows up at home with the bag, and she's like, "What's in that bag?" And he's like, "It's full of money." And it's just like, it's so funny because like she's like, "Oh, that'll be the day." Like, you know, like these exchanges are so good. And then just like the idea of like that is what it is, and he could just say that because he knows that she'd never believe it, and no one would. So I don't know, so funny.
I'm really excited to talk about like how things end up for those two characters as well.
Well, let's move into more plot then. So, Carson Wells, a rival hitman and ex-special forces officer who is familiar with Chigurh, is also on the trail of the stolen money. After a brutal shootout that spills across the Mexican border and leaves both Moss and Chigurh wounded, Moss recovers at a Mexican hospital, while Chigurh patches himself up in a hotel room with stolen supplies. While recuperating, Moss is approached by Wells, who offers to give him protection in exchange for the satchel. After recovering and leaving the hospital room, Chigurh finds Wells and murders him, just as Moss calls to negotiate the exchange of the money. After answering Wells' phone, Chigurh tells Moss that he will kill Carla Jean unless he hands over the satchel. Moss remains defiant and soon after calls Carla Jean and tells her that he will meet up with her in a motel in El Paso. Let's start with Wells, who, by the way, I don't like having a character named Bell and a character named Wells. It's very like visually hard to differentiate.
Something them. About 4 to 5 letter like last names started like Bell, Moss, Wells, Ellis. There's a lot of like shorter names, and people are called by their last name a lot. And it was like, at first it took me a little bit to like really nail down who the characters were. Yeah. But by this point, like halfway through, I was definitely familiar.
I found Wells to be really interesting, right? Like he's this other kind of hitman who has a whole different operating principle, seems much more driven by greed. He's ex-special forces, and he comes in, he's very cocky, but he's very intelligent. He seems very capable. And he's got this plan, like I can take out Chigurh for you.
I love that when we so my introduction to the character. First of all, I wanted to say like I don't know how much you remember of the movie. I really don't remember all that much. I remembered like Chigurh and some of the major details.
Mm-hmm. I remember it pretty well.
How much? Okay, so I didn't remember a character like Wells or anything like that.
Really?
So
yeah, I remember.
When Wells shows up, I immediately was like, oh, there's no way this guy can compete with Chigurh. Mm-hmm. Like I knew that right off the bat. But then he gives you this great scene where Wells goes after Moss and ends up like cornering Moss and showing like he is extremely capable and he is very intimidating. Yep. But then ultimately like just no match for just the sheer force of will, like we've said that Chigurh is.
Yeah, Chigurh definitely gets the best of him. Their scene together where Chigurh executes him, I thought was just like so memorable. Unbelievably good. I wanted to read a section from that part because for those of you who've seen the movie and you're wondering, like, why should I bother with the book, right? Like, what do you get in the book that you don't get in the movie? I have an example of that here. So this is talking about Wells as he's about to get shot by Chigurh. He did close his eyes. He closed his eyes and he turned his head and he raised one hand to fend away what could not be fended away. Chigurh shot him in the face. Everything that Wells had ever known or thought or loved drained slowly down the wall behind him. His mother's face, his first communion, women he had known. The faces of men as they died on their knees before him. the body of a child dead in a roadside ravine in another country. He lay half headless on the bed, with his arms outflung, most of his right hand missing. Chigurh rose and picked up the empty casings off the rug and blew into it and put it in his pocket and looked at his watch. The new day was still a minute away. So he had been counting time up to this point because he had like basically seen this bullet hole in a calendar and another, when he was like looking at this dead woman, and he was like, well, I'm a minute away from the day of the bullet hole, which is when apparently I'm going to die. And then I think it's fascinating that he dies a minute before, right? Like just before the fulfillment of that fated sort of prophecy.
Because like, I mean, we've said it a little bit, but Chigurh is very much sort of a believer in fate, because we have this scene where he goes into a convenience store and like, this guy's life is on the line.
Oh,
based
the
on
coin
a coin
flip.
flip.
Oh man, what is one of my favorite scenes on like any media, like just incredibly good. And so much of it is right on the page that makes it to the movie.
Yeah. So this character, like seeing the calendar with a bullet hole, is like for him to see that as a sign and to think like, okay, that's a fated, like that's important. That's like it's just like, so it makes for such an interesting character, because it's like,
and Chigurh
he's like beholden to fate, but like at the same time, like you said, he does it before the prophecy would actually be 100% fulfilled, because it's like right before.
So it's like Chigurh is asserting dominance over even fate. Like in that moment, he's like, I'm going to rob this moment of the fated, outcome. I don't know. It's really fascinating. And then, I love the idea of this guy's life, on the wall draining down. And we get this moment of revelation about this dead child. And what is your take on that moment? Like, why is that included?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I kind of felt like it was something that was important to Wells, obviously, like whether it was like a dead like relative or someone he like regretted killing, or so, what I mean, something that stuck with him in that way.
That was my take. Yeah, I think this is a child who he regretted either killing or doing something that resulted in his death. And I think the reason we get that moment is this is insight into why this man became a hitman, and like what was the thing that set him down the path of becoming someone who is able to execute all these people, because he's killed many people. This is a bad dude, right? Like we we know that. I think that's the moment, and that's why we get this just little detail that is kind of just given to you and not really explained. But I think you can extrapolate out a lot from it.
And like you said, that is the advantage to this medium, right? Like, so when we see it on film, it's shocking and it's like brutal and everything. But the moments that Cormac McCarthy is able to create right there, where he's like, oh, his first communion, we're seeing the flashes of his life as he probably did right before he died, and like the way that just evokes like so much like humanity is like, it's like really hard to pull something like that off in film. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, that's the strength of fiction. So yeah, you can look forward to stuff like that if you wanted to read the book, which I recommend doing. So yeah, let's talk. I mean, there's so much violence, right? And it's so thrilling, this back and forth cat and mouse game between Chigurh and Llewellyn, in and out of hotel rooms. You got the bag being like passed between vents, which I couldn't believe was a detail out of the book. It seemed like such a movie thing. Yeah. But it's right there in the book.
Again, yeah.
All this stuff that goes down with Chigurh and the trading of the rooms and the creeping in and executing people, the tracking device. I don't know, man. It's so well done, and it's so expertly
written. When Chigurh makes it into the room where Moss is eventually, and the shootout happens, like Moss is under the bed and realizes like he's totally fucked, and he just like decides to roll out and pull the gun on Chigurh. And then he hasn't thought anything through, and he tries to run down the stairs and run away. But by the time he gets far enough away,
another moment where his mercy is, the thing that kills him, right? Yeah, or leads to his eventual downfall.
He had a chance to kill him right there, yeah. And then he's getting shot in the back while he's running away, and like he's just like running into the desert basically, and then like trying to run to like Mexico.
Yeah.
Just a wild, very tense. Those scenes that like play out very similarly in the movie, like if I remember correctly.
And there's just so much carnage. And then I don't know about you, but it was interesting to see these police. It always felt like they were showing up like 2 crime scenes ago. Like it's like, oh, they're just now getting to that guy he killed. We've already gone on to like 6 other crimes since then. Yeah. So it did feel very like they were just like, so overwhelmed, overmatched. They had no chance of catching up to it. It was like they were so far behind.
I loved when they finally figured out like the cattle killing device. when they finally figured that out, Cormac McCarthy in the text had to keep being like, remember, the police don't know this yet.
Yeah.
You do. You know this, but the police still hadn't figured this out. And I just love those moments where, and then eventually when they figure it out, it's just so brutal. What a brutal like thing to do. And like, the way that it looks like a bullet wound, but it doesn't leave any, there's nothing left behind, and it doesn't go all the way through. Yeah. So it's just it would be such a hard thing to figure out.
It does remind me of one of the things that I actually really liked was the interaction between the different sheriffs. Bell, whenever he would interact with other law enforcement, and again, like I recognize that this is all sort of romanticized, but this is a Western in a lot of ways, so that's kind of why they have these little like back and forths. And one of the things that you just made me think of was how he didn't want to like give it away to the guy. He's like, you just think about it, you'll figure it out, and it was kind of like he knew that this would be like a fun puzzle for the other guy to figure out. I don't know, like rather than just share the information.
I almost felt like he wanted to like have a one up over this guy, kind of like he still wanted to be like more in the know than this
really
guy.
Because I got it more of like, hey, I have the answer to this crossword, but you'll get there, and when you do, it'll be worth it. I don't want to give it to you. Like I think he wanted
that's pretty morbid. That's pretty fucked if that was the case.
That's what I got though. Like the other scene I loved was, I think it was him and another sheriff. It was him and another police officer. I don't know, I forget who it was, but they were on horseback going to the scene after the drug deal, and they're like following the different tracks, and he talks about the night tracks versus the day tracks with the truck, and it was so old school, right? Like the idea of these two police officers on horseback tracking like truck tracks. I don't know, it's really it's that old school style versus the new chaos on display here.
Well, and there's like one of those like preambles before the chapter starts where Bell's like sort of in the modern day thinking about the 80s, where he's thinking about like technology, and is it good if technology is given, like newer technology is given to the police and stuff, and how like it's like he's worried that like it'll trickle down to like normal people, and then normal people have deadlier weapons and like different kinds of technology, and like again pushing back against like any change in that way.
There's a couple of times where Bell says shit that just like really gets me frustrated. One example is him talking about people with green hair and bones in their noses, which bones in the nose is very racist, like phrasing. For one, it's also just the kind of shit I heard a lot growing up, like that like green hair was somehow a sign of like the declining morality of the youth of America. And I know that he might be doing it for that very specific reason of like, this is the kind of shit these people say.
In the 80s for sure.
Especially in the 80s. And this kind of guy would say, but it just, it frustrates me because I'm like, it's such a like superficial thing to worry about.
It's so old school. It's like the oldest of old school.
And then the other thing was the decline, how all of this begins as soon as you start being okay with people not saying sir and ma'am anymore.
Yeah, I hate that kind
of shit. That's like that's like the seed of all evil is that.
Yeah,
that just frustrates the hell out of me. So again, it's like these little details that kept coming up that made me like repulsed in a way of like that idea is so maddening to me. But I was still having such a good time reading the book. Like I'm really struggling to like figure out how much I actually like this book.
Yeah,
it's weird.
I think I know where I land personally, but I understand what you're saying about the because it is troubling and it is annoying to have to read something like that. But you know that those people are like that. Yeah. Like that is true to life.
But is Cormac McCarthy one of those people? And is he saying that this is the way to go? And I don't know. I can't tell from this book.
He's a 90-year-old man, so it's like in the 80s he was, what?
No, but 50s? He wrote this in 2005.
Oh, okay. So then, I mean, like, so it wasn't that long ago.
I really feel like this book was written as a response to 9/11, right? Where it became very America, like, first, and all these foreigners are coming here and attacking us, and that feels...
He really is at that point, he's an old man.
Yeah.
In 2005, he's an old man, and, like, I wonder, I don't know. Honestly, like, I think some of him has to be in this book. I'm sure that he believes in some of these things here and there.
Yeah. It's at least questions that he is grappling with, because again, all of these things are not set up and then not, interrogated.
Exactly.
They are, and they're not just presented as the whole truth. Like Bell says, like, but what do I know? And like, I'm just an old man, and like, I don't know anything. And like, he says stuff like that a lot,
Yeah.
So anyway.
I do like the willingness to sort of question it rather than just saying like, this is how things are.
Yeah.
You know, because I think that that's the point. I give McCarthy the benefit of the doubt in that way, that at least like he seems like the kind of person that like when presented with like realistic information, he would probably be willing to like see both sides instead of just being like, no, this is the old way of doing things. This is how I've always done it. So this is how it's going to be.
Oh, one more I have to talk about. The survey anecdote. Which, first off, I don't even know if I believe. But second off, it just seems like it has so many ways you can shoot holes on it. He gives this anecdote about how there was a survey given to students in, like, the 30s.
It was World War II.
Yeah.
Like right around World War II.
I think it was before it, maybe, or around the start of it, before America was in it. About, like, what was troubling them in school. And all the responses were about, like, not having enough paper, or like, someone said something mean to me, or, like, it was very, like, stupid.
Yeah, cheating on a test.
Like yeah. And then they gave the same survey to kids today, and it was, like, rape and murder and drug use and all this stuff. And this was, like, presented as just this sign of the declining morality of... And I will say, in the book's defense, later when he talks to his uncle gives an account of life in those times that is very different from what we hear there, right? About
that's the thing, right? They're always looking through rose-tinted glasses back at the past.
Exactly. And so, like, I grant that is being dealt with in a way that interrogates that. But that moment, I was just so frustrated because, like, there's so many things that, you know, like, who was being surveyed? What schools are we talking about here? Like, what did these students actually feel comfortable talking about? Was it okay to complain about?
Exactly.
You know, could you even mention the word rape? Was that something that people could talk about at that time in the way that we do today?
With the taboos in society that time, would a child be able to tell an adult that something like that had happened?
And were they only you know, surveying certain schools, you know, which, like, you know, anyway. Very frustrating, especially when, like, you don't get the actual data to look at, and someone just trots out some anecdote like that. It frustrates the hell out of me. Anyway, not super important, but it's the kind of stuff that keeps coming up in these little sections that, like, forces you to think about it. Okay, let's get the final bit of summary, and then we can just kind of wrap up the book. So Carla Jean decides to inform Sheriff Bell about the meeting with Llewellyn and its location. Unfortunately for her and her husband, this call is traced and provides Moss's location to some of his hunters. Later, Sheriff Bell goes to the hospital to identify Moss's body, murdered by a band of Mexicans who are also after the drug deal cash. That night, Chigurh arrives at the scene and retrieves the satchel from the air duct in Moss's room. He returns it to its owner and later travels to Carla Jean's house. She pleads for her life, and he offers her to flip a coin to decide her fate. But she loses, and Chigurh shoots her. Soon after, he is hit by a car, which leaves him severely injured but still alive. After bribing a pair of teenagers to remain silent after the car accident, he limps off down the road. After a long investigation that fails to locate Chigurh, Bell decides to retire and drives away from the local courthouse, feeling overmatched and defeated. At the end of the book, Bell describes a dream he experienced after his father died. In the dream, Bell was riding his horse through a snow-covered pass in the mountains. As he rode, he could see his father up ahead of him carrying a moon-colored horn lit with fire, and he knew that his father would ride on through the pass and fix a fire out in the dark and cold, and that it would be waiting for him when he arrived. Okay, so let's back up here, because one of the, like, craziest moments in this book and in the movie, Llewellyn dies so unceremoniously, but it is very different in the book. I will grant that, because he picks up this hitchhiker who doesn't ever get named. I don't think they ever actually know each other by name. She's young. I think she's like 15. And he picks her up, and they have this interaction, and he talks to her about her future. She wants to go to Hollywood, California, and, like, start her life over. And he ends up giving her all of the money. Because he has this money, he doesn't know what to do with it. So he's going to give it to her, and he has this, like, moment of, like, connecting human to human. He intends to go to Carla Jean. That's where he's, like, said that he is still intending to go. And they have this sort of final heart-to-heart. And this is then followed immediately with him being dead. Like, the next scene we get is the police responding to him he's been killed.
One of the things that I wanted to say though, with that whole interaction with the girl, the hitchhiker that he picks up, is like he's seeding this idea of like, is he going to cheat on Carla? Is he going to like have sex with this young 15-year-old? Because there's a lot of like flirting going on. She wants to like stay and drink beer with him and stuff, and she's like, stay in my room. And he decides he makes the moral decision to walk away and say like, no, I don't want to, and so like in that way we see that character, and that's the last decision we see that character make. And this entire time, and then like tragically, like you said, the next scene is we're getting the perspective of them having been mowed down. We basically were just told like, they were killed in like a shooting.
And not by Sugar, because we just like some random guys.
Random. Well, they can't. They were, we know that they were somewhat after the money. They were like tracking him somehow and like came after him. And then the part that's like heartbreaking is like this idea that like gets picked up by the media. Then they run with is like he was like ran away with, it looks like he ran away with this young 15-year-old girl with all the money and everything like that. And we get the perspective from his wife, and she just of course doesn't want to believe it, but ultimately like what does it look like? And he was just doing his best to like save this hitchhiker. He was doing right by her, and then made the decision to go back to Carla, and like he wanted his old life back. He was sick of all the things they were having to go through, and then they're just mowed down. Like this idea of life not being fair and the randomness of life just continues to permeate this novel, and then we get into that with Shigur in a second as well.
I want to touch on this conversation they have, because it's speaking to the exact same things that you're talking about there, and I think this is one of the more fascinating bits of thematic writing, in my opinion, in the book. So this is Llewellyn speaking with his hitchhiker he picked up. He looked at her. After a while, he said, "It's not about knowing where you are. It's about thinking you got there without taking anything with you. Your notions about starting over, or anybody's. You don't start over. That's what it's about. Every step you take is forever. You can't make it go away. None of it. You understand what I'm saying?" I think so. "I know you don't, but let me try it one more time. You think when you wake up in the morning, yesterday don't count. But yesterday is all that does count. What else is there? Your life is made out of the days it's made out of. Nothing else. You might think you could run away and change your name, and I don't know what all. Start over. Then one morning you wake up and look at the ceiling, and guess who's laying there." So I really like that. Like this, I don't know. This is the kind of stuff I think about a lot, and like how there is this idea that your life can always be better, and that one day I'll do the things that I want to do. I'll be the person I want to be. And this unwillingness to look at the person you are and look at the days that you have lived as the thing that actually makes up your life. And, the person you are, you can't really escape from, and like, or not escape from, but like, you just are that person. Like, you are the days of your life. That's everything that makes you up.
Yeah. But you can decide to look forward and like say like, I'm not going to be defined by that person that I was, and like I'm going to be defined by the person that I will be, sort of thing, right?
Yes, I think that's true, but I think Cormac McCarthy is sort of arguing against that here, right? Like he's saying like, no matter what, you are the sum of all the days you've lived and your life up to that point. And people just dream of this one day, and fail to realize the reality of who they are. And I just, I like stopped and had to mark this page when I read it, because I was like, I want to return to this,
Yeah, we kind of get something along these lines with Shigur as well, when he talks about like every moment, I think it's when he's killing Wells, every moment in Wells' life leads up to the moment where he's sitting there in front of him about to be killed by a bullet. So every decision he made, every turn he made, everything he did in his life led to that specific moment. And so it's like, was that fate? Was that your decision making? Was that,
And he returns to that with Carla Jean when he goes to kill her, and he talks, and he ends up, it's interesting because it's like the only moment of slight mercy that we see is that Shigur grants her a coin flip when he wasn't planning to. And I think that's he actually feels bad, because she says like, what did I do to deserve this? And he's like, you didn't do anything. And the only reason he's there is because of Llewellyn. Like, I promised your husband I would kill you. And so that's why I'm here.
He had the opportunity to save her, and he was like, no, he thought that he could handle Shigur and save her and do everything. And ultimately, like, his decision led to her dying.
Yeah, but Shigur gives her the coin flip, yet she loses it.
It fails.
Yeah.
Life's not fair. But then the best part about all of this is that he jumps in a car and then it almost immediately gets struck by a vehicle.
Gets plowed
He's
into.
driving in the
so
car.
it's that like fated chance, right? Like this. But in the one of the
Or is it just
differences,
random?
we'll talk about in the movie is I think it's more unclear whether or not he survives. But the implication I get here is that he does in the book, at least.
Well, I mean, he goes and gets like he splints his arm. He goes and gets like painkillers and stuff, and he goes and cleans it in the bath. We see eventually.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
Cleans
That's not
himself out.
that's not the bullet wounds we're talking about. The reason I thought that the stuff where he like goes and talks to the guy about the money, I thought that was after chronologically, because we get this like this happens and then we get like we go back in time to the Carla Jean stuff. I thought.
Gotcha.
I don't know. I could be wrong about that, but my reading of it was that Chigurh lives on past this moment, and that's why Belle is still searching for him, right? Like there was no body or anything.
Yeah, no,
found.
I think he definitely lives on past this. I just don't know about the order of the scenes, like you're saying.
My memory of the movie is that it's more unclear whether or not Chigurh gets away and survives. Maybe I'm wrong.
Gotcha.
Maybe when I revisit it,
I think I have a different memory. I think I remember very distinctly. There's like a last shot of him, but we'll see.
Well, he definitely gets away, but like.
Though.
He has like such a gnarly like compound fracture. It's like he could die from infection or something. I don't know. But anyway, regardless, I would assume he probably would live just because this guy's fucking so tough and everything. Like
he's the Terminator.
Yeah, he's the Terminator. Yeah. But yeah, like it's interesting that after this moment of like, is this moment of mercy what leads to this crash? Like I don't know. Like, and I don't think Cormac McCarthy knows. I think it's just like the questions are there.
I think that's why it's there. Yeah. So that there's like that ambivalence. It's like. You know, you have to decide what you think. Was it fate that he was always going to get hit by a vehicle? Is he again showing the randomness of the universe, and is this some sort of comeuppance? There's a lot to be talked about there.
So we got to talk about Uncle Ellis, because I really liked his conversation with Ellis, who he is a character who really throws a lot of the shit that Belle has been saying into question.
Yeah.
Ellis brings up about how, I could tell you some stories about your father, who you think is this great man who, would handle everything better than you would. And he's like, no, don't do that. You wouldn't do that. And he like doesn't even want to hear it. And then he's like, he talks about like all the young people that died back in the wars, World War II, it sounds like he's basically talking about like America's sins and how America has a lot of stuff to answer for, and a lot of sordid history that I think Belle likes to ignore.
There's also a really interesting story that he gives, and I think it's about himself or maybe Belle's father, but it's the story about in World War II, he picks up like a machine gun, and he's just shooting down like Germans or something like that. And then ultimately like he gets like a Medal of Honor or something like that.
So that's Belle telling the story of how he got a Medal of Honor. He got this Bronze Star. And so he's confessing to Ellis about this moment of cowardice and how his entire life he's been trying to like make up for that. And I thought Ellis...
specifically the medal and like how he wanted to reject it. Yeah. But then basically America telling him like, no, you're going to receive this to cover up for all these atrocities, to make it look like it was worth something. Like that moment had meaning because you were a hero in it. And it's like all those people died due to somebody's orders. Ultimately somebody ordered them to be in that position probably. Yeah,
and I think it also just... This talks about the idea of like the America that people believe in and that people see versus the reality and what is actually going on. And I think Ellis is trying to say like, your shame is not completely unique to you. Because Belle like has been living with the shame of this moment, and he's been trying to live this virtuous life, and he's struggling because he's unable to like reach that standard that he set for himself. But Ellis is like saying, everybody does this. Our country does this. We're all living with shame and with lies that we tell ourselves. It's all bullshit, right? Like it's another look at nihilism from a different angle. But it's kind of shooting holes in Belle's whole thesis of how America used to be so amazing and how, everybody didn't have to worry about anything in the 30s. And like, no, Ellis is talking about these same time periods where, all this shit was going down. So again, it's interrogating a lot of the shit that Belle has been saying up to this point. So yeah, we finish with Belle retiring. He gives up and he goes into retirement, and he's happy with his wife, but he's like a defeated man, right, at this point. And Chigurh doesn't get any comeuppance. And this is the way that it really deviates from a lot of Westerns, right? Like Chigurh wins essentially. He doesn't get to kill Llewellyn. We don't even get a confrontation between the two. He gets to kill Llewellyn's, widow. So it's this like inversion of the things that we would expect from a Western story. And that's why this isn't a Western. It's this like weird post-Western thing, because this doesn't fit the genre at all. Right. And it's really fascinating. And just like, what was your take on like, why did Cormac McCarthy go this route instead of like having Llewellyn and Sugar have a showdown? Like what's interesting and like different about this that he wanted to explore?
I just think that because this is like your post-Western, neo-Western kind of thing, where like this happens with genre over time. Like there's so many stories that are told within that framework, and then these stories come out as a reaction to that. So Cormac McCarthy wasn't interested in, like, we've seen the battle between the two leads before, the antagonist and the protagonist. He wanted to tell a story that didn't have anything to do with that as much as it had to do with like more philosophical thoughts, like more digging into society and where America is at, and like what it means to think about your morality as you get or your mortality as you get older, and like what that does to you and the way that it makes you look back at the past, as we've talked about. Like, it's interesting that we're left with Bell, because it's like, is he going to turn into Uncle Ellis, or is he going to turn into like just continue down this path of himself like refusing to confront the future? Like, he just wants everything to be like it used to be. And like this idea of him like running away with his tail between, he retires, right? And he's like, I can't beat Sugar. It's time for me to retire. It's almost like that's also what Moss did. He gave the money away. He's like, I don't want the money. I realize I don't want the money. I want to go back to my normal life. And like we were talking about, like people not really living in the present. Like ultimately in that way, I think like we're able to see Bell make the decision to be like, I want to cut out of this and like just live a happy life while I still can, and try to like, be the better person that I can. Whereas Moss didn't have that opportunity. He wanted to do it, but he didn't have the opportunity.
He essentially had signed his own death warrant, right? Like he died the moment he decided to take that money. And I think there was even a moment of like knowledge when he did it. Like he realized that like this was
they
going
would
to
never
change
stop
everything.
chasing him. Yeah, he would be chased for his whole life. And Bell, I think if Bell chases Sugar, he dies in this story. So I think that's the decision making process there for him. Is he's like, I'm giving up because I don't want, I want to live my life with his wife Loretta.
Well, and Bell represents to me this like old school rugged individualism. This just I'm righteous in my morality. I see the world as black and white, and I'm sort of disgusted by the evil I see out there, and it's up to me to like fight it. And he ends up
which is the old Western archetype,
right? And then he ends up feeling like I can't. There's too much. I'm overwhelmed. I just have to surrender to it.
Yeah.
But to me, it shows a failure of imagination on his part, the ability to see the world in a different way. Like that, if you do see the world that way, then I think this is the logical conclusion, right? This nihilist, like nothing can be done, throw your hands in the air, despair. But if you let go of that view of the world, that us versus them, that individualist approach, and look at things more holistically, look at things from a societal level, look at things from, community, and not pitting people against each other for all these different reasons. It's not to say that it solves everything, but that line of thinking is not explored here. It's kind of just dismissed outright by Bell, and instead it's like the only way he knows to view the world is the idea of a lawman versus the criminals. And I think it's interesting that at the end of the book we get an example of him of this guy getting put to death for a crime he didn't commit. And he knows that he didn't commit it, yet he can't save him. And so it's a failure of the justice system right at the end of the book, right? And so even that is shown to be false. And the ultimate thing he decides is like, it all is meaningless, and I don't know what to do other than it's all gonna go to hell. Whereas I feel like this should be a jumping off point to how else can I view the world, and that's where I guess I wish the novel led, but that's okay that it doesn't. And I think it's really interesting still, as is. And ultimately, do like this book. And I think I'm still going to give it five stars on Goodreads. When I think about it, it's just written too well for anything else. Even though I do feel like I fundamentally disagree with a lot of it, it's still really interesting to see the arguments laid out in a compelling way, and the thought process is laid out in a compelling way, and to engage with these ideas. Like, I want people to be thinking about this. I don't know that I agree with a lot of the messages people are going to take away from it, but I was able to find something in there to where I felt like I would, I'm a better person for having read this book in a weird way, even though it's so dark and twisted.
Well, you can read something like this and be like, oh, I disagree with that. That reinforces my way of thinking in a way that, like, I know that I've now confronted these other ways of thinking, which is what Bell's doing throughout the novel. He's like trying to confront other ways of thinking, but ultimately kind of falls back on what he thinks, what's like his archetype. Yeah. And like us as people, we can see it and be like, oh, like I wouldn't have done that. I would have done this. Like you said, you would go turn to the community and try to like band together.
And maybe Bell ultimately is a coward in that way. And so he's returning to that cowardice because he's unwilling to take up the fight and to not to take up the fight, but to like find a new way to tackle these problems outside of his framework. And instead he's just going to surrender. And that's kind of the way I view it in the end, at least. But I'm sure many people would disagree with me and will disagree with me when they hear this. But that's what I got from the book. And I'm very excited to go into the film next week and revisit a lot of this stuff, talk about the ways in which I think the movie is even more subtle in some ways. Like it doesn't sort of lay out the themes as directly as it did in the book, or at least doesn't get into them as deeply. While still being very faithful in a lot of ways. So I'm definitely interested and excited to get into that next week.
Yeah, I really can't wait.
So here at the end of the episode, we wanted to thank Sarah H. for being a Patreon supporter. Our patrons are able to keep this podcast going through the donations. So, a heartfelt thank you to everyone who supports us that way. If you wanted to support us in a way that doesn't require any money at all, leave us a rating and review on whatever app you listen to us on today. We would love to have the additional, words of encouragement that can be out there in the world and hopefully get some more listeners in on the fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And make sure to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Oh, and hey, we just had an episode where James and I were interviewed by Tyler of the Between Lewis and Lovecraft podcast, where we talk about like our the creations of Ink to Film, like what was the initial ideas behind it, and then James and I struggle like hell to like come up with favorite authors and favorite directors for a while, so you can hear us squirm as we try. It was a lot of fun, and I think that episode just came out, so check out Between Lewis and Lovecraft and look for that correspondence episode with Ink to Film.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, Coen Brothers next week, which is filmmakers we have not talked about yet, and I'm definitely very excited to get to. And until next time.
Thanks for listening.